Well, if it isn't the wall-crawling creep. Here's one wall you'll never crawl, you red and blue buffoon. Wall you'll never crawl, you red and... Wall you'll never crawl, you red and... Wall you'll never crawl, you red and blue buff. He's so dumb, he's trying to eat a hot dog with no mouth.
There's no conceivable way I can actually analyse The Wall for an hour, right? It's just going to be me pulling stuff out my ass about how his red bricks symbolise child neglect, like I'm some sort of depressed English teacher. At least, that's what you would say, if you didn't know his moving, heartfelt story, or the real-life events that were behind his creation. We're going to look at other ridiculous villains from the time, such as the Big Wheel. We're going to discover what truly makes a tragic villain, and lastly, the genuine life-changing messages that The Wall has to offer. I had to condense this into an hour. Spider-Man's always had his fair share of ridiculous villains, and they can be measured on a scale of how much crack the writer was smoking. Towards the bottom you have lesser known ones like Typeface and Spider-Side, and then as you reach the top you of course have such holy figures as the infamous Big Wheel. As laughably brilliant as some of these guys are, none quite reach the levels of The Wall himself. His first appearance was in Spidey Super Stories, a comic book produced by Marvel in partnership with the kids' television show The Electric Company. Essentially the whole thing was just a big advertisement for Electric. A poor man's Sesame Street which had a lot of well-known faces in it. The cast included Morgan Freeman, Rita Moreno, one of the only people to win an Emmy, Grammy, Oscar and Tony Award in one lifetime, and everyone's favourite sex offender, Bill Cosby. At the start of the show's 4th season in 1974, Electric signed a deal with Marvel which would allow them to use Spider-Man in one of their recurring segments. In these sketches, Spider-Man always appeared in costume and he would never talk out loud, instead communicating through speech bubbles. The aim of the segment was to give the kids a bit of light-hearted fun, some high-stakes action, and a lesson at the end about how you shouldn't abuse your teachers or something. Spider-Man would appear in these skits, and each one would be retold pretty much beat for beat in the Marvel comic version. The comic would usually have more detail and backstory, while the show would often simplify the story in favour of its fever dream-like presentation. The advertising was as blatant as it could ever be. Oh no, Spider-Man, the Electric Company is in danger. How else are kids gonna watch the greatest show of all time, which just so happens to be on tonight at 6, you cheeky bitch? I'm not gonna lie, a lot of these sketches are genuinely enjoyable with just how bizarre they are, and it seems like they had a lot of fun making them.
That will be $126.
That's what you think! Here!
Come on, Spider-Man! Oh, I hate you, Green Blob!
Suddenly, Dracula appears.
What's funny is that this show came out before that old Amazing Spider-Man movie, making this the first ever live-action depiction of Spider-Man.
Spider-Man, where are you coming from, Spider-Man? Nobody knows who you are.
In this particular sketch, Spidey up against The Wall, a genius play on the popular phrase, Spider-Man is tired of fighting crime and wants a break, and so he goes to a baseball game to watch his favourite team, the New York Mets. Little does Spider-Man know, his well-deserved holiday is about to be cut short by his soon-to-be most feared villain, The Wall, or as he's perhaps lesser known as, Joshua. Joshua Waldemar was your typical high school student who had a part-time job laying bricks. Then one day, the bricks tragically fell on top of him and he was instantly transformed into a living brick wall. That's it, there's no explanation, he just turns into a fucking wall! He gains superhuman strength, endurance, and is able to run faster than your average wall. For no apparent reason, the Wall decides he's going to ruin Spider-Man's day off, and sneaks into the Mets game to wreak havoc. As one of the players is about to make a catch, the Wall creeps up on him and knocks him down, causing the player severe head trauma. Spider-Man just sits there and lets this guy die, which you could say is out of character, but I'll chalk it up to the Wall's insane speed and he just couldn't react in time. While Spider-Man does fuck all, the heroic umpire stands up when no one else will, played by Morgan Freeman himself.
That's not funny! Says right here in the rule book, that's not funny!
The Wall is outraged at the audacity of Morgan Freeman, and savagely murders him before the audience. Spider-Man finally decides that enough is enough, and jumps onto the field to confront the Wall. Before the two can properly duke it out, Morgan Freeman brings himself back to life and pulls out his trusty rulebook.
Clearly states that no spectators or walls are allowed on the field of play. So I'm throwing you out of the ballpark and take that ball with you. Lucky I didn't slap him with a $50 fine. I can be pretty stupid when I want to be.
They're so intimidated by Morgan Freeman's sheer dedication to his sport that they do what he says and leave the stadium together. The story ends with Spider-Man and the Wall sitting side by side outside the stadium, disappointed that they won't see the result of the game. Alright, that's cool, but where's the tragedy I was promised? Shh, patience, you fuckhead. Now, there's two possibilities. Either this bizarre series of events was just the writers being lazy because it's just a dumb show for kids, or the whole thing is self-aware and its parodical nature is just part of the joke. I can't tell which one, which in itself is comedic genius. Honestly, I'm fine with the tone being ambiguous. I just have one question. Why? Who allowed this beautiful abomination on TV? Which awe-inspiring writer had the sheer balls to put pen to paper and channel this riveting, heart-wrenching story through their mind and onto the screen? Let's find out, shall we? First we have Tom Whedon, father of Joss Whedon, who wrote the telescript that the comic is based on. He's also the mastermind behind such characters as The Tickler, the Queen of Diamonds, and Funny Bunny was a nice normal person until a bully sat on her Easter basket, and so she turned to a life of crime, stealing Easter baskets from little children. Oh, fuck! I'm not here to criticise Whedon's writing. We all know its target demographic and supposed self-awareness. But what's interesting is that his father, John Whedon, was also a television writer, which would suggest that Tom only got the opportunities that he did because of his family, not because of his merit as some sort of creative genius. We'll give Tom the benefit of the doubt. What about the writer of the comic series, Gene Thomas? Before Spidey's Super Stories, Thomas had only written a few issues for Marvel, working on the very limited series Night Nurse, short stories for romance books, and Crazy magazine. What's also interesting is that she was the wife of prolific Marvel writer Roy Thomas, who created hundreds of Marvel characters such as Wolverine, Ghost Rider, and Vision. There seems to be a bit of a pattern here. Oh! It's nepotism! The Wall is the illegitimate child of nepotism, the entertainment industry's biggest plague, next to sex trafficking, assassinations, and pretending to care about poor people. Remember that Spider-Man book that came out a couple years ago? I think it was by Henry Abrams? Me neither. It's set in an alternate universe, and follows Spider-Man's son after his mother Mary Jane is killed, and Peter just abandons him. But the name Abrams rings a bell. Thousands upon thousands of writers have worked their whole lives, battling up a mountain of hardships and rejection, and still don't get an opportunity to work for a company like Marvel, let alone on their flagship title. But suddenly this kid gets the job because his dad ripped off A New Hope. A mistake that a lot of young writers make, myself included. They see a movie or a show that they really like, and they say, I like that, I can do that. And so they never think about what they're actually writing, they just want to skip over that bit so they can get to the final product. So they can have their own thing that looks like someone else's thing. And that's exactly what happened here. He's just trying to imitate other Spider-Man media, albeit with a darker tone which doesn't really fit the character. And he never stops to ask the point of it all. J. Michael Straczynski's stories are all about potential and perseverance, all told through lessons that he drew from his own life. Brian Michael Bendis focuses on injustice and exploring the relationship that he's crafted between his characters. What's Henry Abrams' story about? Child abandonment? Sure, but why would you choose Peter of all people to represent that? He's like the last person who would leave his son. This lesson about actually saying something can be applied to the subject of this very video. Well, yes, they're presented in a ridiculous manner. The electric company did have some morals to teach the kids. Respect your elders, the importance of kindness, that sort of thing. It explored imposter syndrome and the depression that comes from having fame from an early age. And more often than not, it gave the villain some chance at redemption. Look, Mrs. Former Child Actor, you don't have to steal to survive anymore. Perhaps you can use your strengths as a villain to play a fake villain for our show, and that way you can redeem your career. There's some genuinely good stuff in there. But what about the Wall? What is the Wall saying? Spider-Man is ultimately a bystander for the whole conflict. The exact opposite of Uncle Ben's lesson, which shaped his whole character. There are no real lessons in this one, other than don't murder people? Do what Morgan Freeman tells you to? Probably not the best advice. Where's the redemption? Oh, they sit down together, that's well and nice. How about the Wall gets a chance to use his powers for good? Perhaps he can teach health and safety on a construction site. The Wall's not alone in this. There are plenty of ridiculous villains that don't attempt to say anything. And these villains weren't just exclusive to the electric company. They were everywhere. Everywhere! Which leads me to my next question. Was everyone in the comics industry on drugs? Comics back then were something else. If a book wasn't selling well, or they wanted to attract a new audience, they would just put some weird shit on the cover and hope for the best. This was especially prevalent with the old Superman comics, which is just the funniest shit ever to me. I'm sorry to end your career, but you're a failure as Supergirl. I must exile you to another world. Superman, we're all dying of thirst. You must let us drink the water. Nobody gets a drop. Fucking hell, Superman. Superman helping unplug Batman's life support? Superman stole my wife? Again? And again? Superman has an illegitimate son? Superman is racist? Superman becomes Hitler? There was also a time where everyone was just into gorillas, like, more than usual. Comic publishers found that if a comic had a gorilla on a cover, it sold better than the ones that didn't have a gorilla on it. I'm not making this up, people just loved gorillas. This led to a surge of gorillas in every type of comic, even the ones that had nothing to do with gorillas. Oh, this is a love story? No, it's not, it's a fucking gorilla story. Wonder Woman plays baseball against a gorilla? Jimmy Olsen gets mind swapped with a gorilla? Nazi gorillas? Why do you think Gorilla Grodd exists? Oh yes, I know the perfect villain for the fastest man alive, the antithesis to everything he represents. A fucking gorilla! They even had to create a gorilla limit because there was just too many fucking gorillas. The publishers at DC were like, okay, only one gorilla a month now, which they ended up having to break anyway because people just, they just couldn't get enough fucking gorillas. This whole obsession with weird shit led to the creation of some really bizarre villains. Look no further than Armless Tiger Man. Armless Tiger Man was a German mechanic in World War II, when one day his arms were caught in one of his machines and they were completely sliced off. Once recovered, he had developed an eternal hatred for all machines, so he spent years training his feet and his mouth, reaching peak physical condition so he could beat up all the machines. He was then recruited by the Nazis, who were like, hey, you want to destroy some machines? How about we drop you in America and you can destroy all of their machines? While in America destroying all the machines, Armless Tiger Man was caught and taken in by the FBI. While in custody, they put a device around his legs so that if he tries to escape, it'll shred his legs off. Is that legal? That's like actually torture. Armless, legless Tiger Man? The poor guy was completely forgotten about until he was brought back 80 years later. It was revealed that he escaped from the FBI and was recruited by the Red Skull to torture prisoners. While trying to capture some Wakandans, Armless Tiger Man was forced to face his greatest weakness, getting shot in the head. And thus the tragic villain was put to rest for good. Armless Tiger Man was known to engage in cannibalism. You have Rocket Racer, a guy who loves skateboards and stealing things. You have the infamous Kite Man. I know he's not a Spider-Man villain, but he deserves the mention. And then of course you have everyone's favourite spherical supervillain, the aforementioned Big Wheel. Despite the amount of ridicule he gets, the Big Wheel actually has somewhat of a heartfelt story. I'm being serious. Jackson Wheel, spelled W-E-E-L-E, was your average rich asshole who'd done some dodgy things with his money and didn't want to get caught. So he did the only thing that anyone would think to do, which is hire the guy who loves skateboards and stealing things to go and steal any incriminating evidence. Rocket Racer manages to steal the evidence, but instead of handing it over, he uses it as blackmail, demanding $10,000 or he'll go to the police. Mr. Wheel is like, okay, there's no way out of this, I'm killing myself, and goes to jump off a bridge. I don't know why he doesn't just pay the money, but okay. Right as he's about to jump off, he is caught by Rocket Racer, who won't let him die until he hands over the money. Again, just pay him, but Mr. Wheel is a man of pride, and so instead of giving in to this bully, he stands up for himself and swears revenge. His first move is going to the Tinkerer, an inventor who builds lots of weapons and gadgets for supervillains. And while they're thinking about what to build him, they're like, Jackson Wheel? Wheel? While Rocket Racer is busy fighting Spider-Man, they're interrupted by the menacing sight of the brand new Big Wheel. They're knocked down, and Big Wheel manically laughs as he speeds towards them, seconds from brutally running them down. But at the last second, Spider-Man just moves out the way, and the Big Wheel spins off the edge and falls into the water, drowning instantly. An intellectual could say that the Big Wheel represents Jackson's ability to keep moving forward, while still being able to roll back to the past and learn from his mistakes. Despite how weird and sometimes off-putting a lot of these villains are, I can't help but admire them. There's something so charming about how seriously the writers take these ludicrous concepts. Sure, they could acknowledge how dumb it is and write lots of meta-humor, but that would take away from the sincere confidence that they have in their ideas. It reminds me of a Taika Waititi quote, or I think he was quoting Jermaine Clement, but anyways.
Dude, the world needs stupid shit. We need an escape. We need these things to remind ourselves that we are stupid creatures.
Sure, I think The Wall is an absolute creative travesty, but that's something that should be celebrated rather than frowned upon. However much joy they bring me, these villains unfortunately commit the same sin as Henry Abrams. I know they're meant to be harmless fun, but there's still the potential to explore serious issues at the same time. You could say that The Big Wheel is a loose criticism of corruption, Rocket Racer is a message against speeding, and Armless Tiger Man says don't join the Nazis. I was on the fence about that one, thanks guys. But ultimately that's just a lot of ass pulling. There's of course the argument that Marvel still have to look out for all of their demographic, which includes the little babies, so anything serious would either go over their heads or be inappropriate. That's not the case though. There are plenty of early Marvel stories, especially Spider-Man ones, that deal with genuine issues like responsibility, poverty, media bias. They always respected their readers because they knew that they dealt with that sort of stuff in their day-to-day lives. However, there were a lot of things that were off limits. In a lot of old comic books, you'll see this little stamp representing the Comics Code Authority. This regulation basically meant that you couldn't have any graphic violence, you couldn't swear, you couldn't disrespect the law, you couldn't have any female characters with unrealistic proportions, and no drugs. Seems fair enough, right? Sure, the rules on paper sound pretty reasonable, and yes, while it is cool to see Batman fucking eviscerate a man, having a mature rating doesn't make a story inherently dark or compelling. It's more about how these rules are enforced, and they were so strict that they restricted the writer's freedom. Just 4 years before The Wall's creation, Stan Lee tried to publish a Spider-Man story condemning the use of drugs. He recognised that young people don't like being told that they can't do something, so he instead subtly incorporated the message into the story. But the Comics Code didn't care that the story was anti-drugs, they just saw the word drugs and was like, nope, fuck you, shut it down. And so Stan Lee just said, screw it, and published the comic without the code's seal of approval, which was unheard of at the time for a big company like Marvel. Stan got a lot of criticism, especially from DC, who said, oh, look at Marvel with their dirty drugs. We're not like them. We'll never publish any drug stories. Unexpectedly, the story sold really well, with lots of parents buying it for their kids due to its positive and well-executed message. Its success forced the Comics Authority to rethink the code and make significant changes to it. DC instantly switched up and were like, oh, we're doing drugs now? Let's have the Red Arrow do heroin. Marvel Comics' now Chief Creative Officer Joe Quesada cited this story as making him a lifelong fan of Spider-Man, saying that, wait, Joe Quesada thought it was good? I actually liked that story. You can probably thank Stan Lee for a lot of the freedom that current writers have today. I think that gritty shows like Daredevil or characters like Deadpool might not have existed had it not been for this change. It's also worth noting that the torture stuff, where Armless Tiger Man was eating people left and right, happened way after the code was revised. But when it was time to birth the Wall into the world, the Comics Code had already been relaxed. I'm not saying that they should have had the Wall start tearing people's flesh with his bare teeth, but they had that freedom to take their characters in a slightly darker direction. Sure, leave the TV part out of it, but use that extra time you've got in the comic to elaborate more on the characters' struggles. I doubt the creators of The Wall set out to do anything more than make a wacky yet unmemorable supervillain, which is such a shame. Some of the most powerful and heartfelt moments can come from really goofy concepts. Ridiculousness makes the reader surrender their emotions because we're hit the hardest when we're expecting to laugh. I know that The Wall is capable of this. For someone to take his comical, outright pathetic existence and use it as a tool to say something. To take advantage of the freedom set by the Comics Code Authority and try and explore some mature and relevant societal themes. How do I know this? Because it's been done before, and holy shit is it dark. If you've seen my Speedball video, most of you have, it's the only thing keeping me alive at this point, but you'll know that I'm a big fan of tragic characters. More specifically, taking these really dumb people and putting them through hell to the point where they become unrecognisable. Speedball's one careless mistake turned him into a self-loathing wreck, indirectly responsible for hundreds of dead schoolchildren. But Speedball wasn't that crazy to begin with. I'm talking about someone way more ridiculous, and if you'll excuse my blasphemy, someone who's maybe on the same level as the Wall. William Turner, better known as Mindworm, was introduced in the pages of Amazing Spider-Man just less than a year before the Wall himself. To begin with, he was just like every other wacky supervillain. He was a mutant whose abnormally large head let him read people's minds and drain their mental energy to make himself stronger. When he was born, he was considered a freak and received no proper support for his deformities. Unable to control his powers at such a young age, he accidentally drained his mother's life force until she died. Traumatized, his dad ran out of the house, where he was struck by a car and died soon after. Mindworm was sent to an orphanage, where he was mercilessly bullied for the way he looked. Eventually he was able to control his powers and escaped the orphanage, using his powers to commit petty crimes. When Spider-Man discovers Mindworm draining the minds of a whole city block, he beats him up and leaves him for the cops to find. It's pretty anticlimactic, with Mindworm begging his victims to come back because he feels so alone. This is way more substance than the rest of the villains could ever dream of, and that alone would be perfectly acceptable. But who cares? Okay, his family's fucking dead. And? He wasn't exactly portrayed sympathetically, not entirely. Sure, he felt guilt over his parents, but look at him, the kid's clearly enjoying this. He also gave these grand evil monologues which suggested that he liked mentally enslaving people. Mindworm had tragedy without purpose. He had an Uncle Ben without the lesson. He's what happens if you cast someone out instead of getting them the help that they need. This origin story attempted to distinguish Mindworm from the lineup of crazy villains, but just like the rest of them, he faded into obscurity shortly after his introduction. He was briefly brought back a few years later for a one-off issue. After his encounter with Spider-Man, he is devastated at the loss of his victims, and that devastation completely takes over his mind, diminishing his powers as a result. It turns out that Mindworm wasn't just draining people because he was lonely, he needed them to survive. And in his weakened state, he is unable to attach himself to anyone, mentally starving himself to death. The police take him to the hospital where he's barely kept alive by machines. His powers start to return, but they're erratic, just like they were when he was a child. While having a nightmare about Spider-Man, he accidentally drags the real Spider-Man into the dream, who is forced to fight off these sleep paralysis type demons. Spider-Man manages to talk him down, appealing to the guilt he feels over his parents and teaches him the lesson of power and responsibility. Mindworm realizes what he's doing and releases him from the dream. When Spider-Man visits Mindworm in the hospital, he's a changed man, having learned the true meaning of responsibility. What a nice happy ending. Then they kiss. Beautiful. But not what I signed up for. Mindworm wouldn't return for another 25 years until Spectacular Spider-Man number 22, an absolutely beautiful issue that doesn't nearly get the recognition it deserves. The issue begins with Peter reflecting on life, and how change is so integral for better or for worse. We have to evolve in order to live, whether it be something as simple as changing your mind, or turning into a massive spider in the previous issue. This reflection is extremely relevant for what's about to happen, just not in the way that Peter would have liked. As he's looking down on the people below, Peter notices something odd. People are going about their business as usual, but it's kind of off. They're being meaner to each other, they're miserable, but it's not like it's their fault. It's not just a few people either, it's the whole city block. Peter's getting deja vu, and it's not long until he narrows the source of the misery down to a single person, a homeless beggar. Peter recognizes him as Mindworm, but the last time he saw him he was doing fine, right? He had learned his lesson and was on a path to recovery. Now he's on the street, drowning in booze, psychically feeding off the local residents to keep himself alive. In typical Spider-Man fashion, Peter blames himself for what happened. He reflects on how he never took Mindworm seriously, how he cracked jokes and beat him up when all he needed was some help. Because he was Mindworm, a ridiculous villain just like all the rest, and people were too focused on how stupid he looked rather than his severe mental illness. And while Peter was content with how he saved the day and got to go home to his loving wife and family, William sat in the cold begging for alcohol to ease the pain of his very existence. Peter spills his sorrows onto Mary Jane and Aunt May. It's not just his guilt over Mindworm, he's also overwhelmed by choice. Let's say he chooses to help Mindworm. Why not any of the other homeless people in the area? And while he's busy saving homeless people, there'll be someone else in danger that equally needs saving. Both Mary Jane and Aunt May reassure him, saying that he's a hero, not a god. and that he can't save everyone. But Peter doesn't listen. He wants to do everything in his power to save as many people as possible, especially if it's his fault. That's the core of Spider-Man, saving people who don't necessarily deserve it, not just sitting around watching murder unfold before his eyes. Peter swings back over to where he found Mindworm, with a makeshift plan to take him to a doctor. Even though he's trying to help, Peter still feels guilty as he's kind of doing this for himself, not just out of the goodness of his heart. Peter lands in the street to discover all of the residents collapsed on the ground, still alive, but barely. Peter frantically searches for a Mindworm, and eventually finds him in a back alley, being ganged up on by a group of thugs. Before Peter has a chance to react, Mindworm lets out a psychic blast, sending everyone into a nightmare vision. This isn't just a simple defense mechanism. His illusions are described as distilled, concentrated like hard liquor, vapors of the heart and soul. These are direct projections of Mindworm's own mental state, making it all the more saddening. Peter is powerless to do anything, and can only sit there and watch as one of the gang members runs up from behind and cracks Mindworm's head open. The gang scatters, and Peter reaches over to check if Mindworm is okay, but it's too late. And as the heavy rain pours down on them, Peter mourns over William's corpse. As horrible and undeserving as it is, it does raise a couple of questions. Spider-Man's stronger than your average human, which is why he wasn't affected by Mindworm's initial projections. If those projections became so strong that even Spider-Man was rendered powerless, how did this normal-ass guy manage to run up and one-shot him? As proven in his second appearance, Mindworm can choose who to bring into his dreams, albeit subconsciously. He must have been in so much pain that his subconscious allowed this person to sneak up on him and violently free him from a lifetime of suffering. No one bothered to help him in time, so he had to do it himself. Because the system failed him. Because Spider-Man failed him. His own brain failed him, to the point where the best option was using what otherwise would have been a gift against himself. It's easy to forget about people when they appear to be fine, when they're on track for a happy ending. Paul Jenkins, writer of Spectacular Spider-Man, took that original ending and reworked it to show the reality of mental illness, and how it's always overlooked until it's too late. And that leads me to my other question. How many others were like this? How traumatized and demented did armless Tiger Man have to be to turn to cannibalism of all things? Why was Rocket Racer stealing things in the first place? Was it because he had no one to turn to or had to support his family? Isn't it sad how Big Wheel's genuine suicide attempt is brushed off because of how fucking dumb his design is? And that's why I think The Wall deserves the title of Spider-Man's most tragic villain. As mistreated as Mindworm was, he was offered help. He had some chance, even if his mental breakdown was sadly inevitable. The Wall had nothing. He's not even arrested at the end, he's just left to fend for himself. In the TV version, he's just told to leave, and we never see him again. In the comic version, both him and Spider-Man are sat on a bench, but Spider-Man seems more concerned about the result of the game more than anything else. What's more is that despite his physical deformity, Mindworm was still able to pass as a human being. Either people just ignored him on the street, or those who did pick on him for it could be silenced using his telepathic abilities. Do you think this guy can exist for a second without being judged, belittled, and pushed to the point of taking his own life? It can be hell if you're wearing different clothes. Imagine being a fucking wall. And it's not like he deserved it either. Big Wheel was a wealthy elite who was insanely corrupt. Armless Tiger Man was a fucking Nazi. The Wall was just a kid whose life was ruined by an unfortunate coincidence and a lack of health and safety regulations. And time again, everyone has done nothing but laugh at him, myself included. We can all do better. Fuck, I'm gonna cry. So why didn't we see The Wall getting help, or at least getting some bittersweet justice? Why did the writers poke fun at him and abandon him as soon as they'd finished telling their silly, trivial nonsense? Casting him into the realm of infinite creative potential, only to be left there and never revived for 40 years. You know what? I'll just do it myself. We're past the 30-minute mark anyway, I can do whatever the fuck I want. Oi! Porque el mundo es tan cruel. Come along with me to a... Mindworm's story is very dark. It features severe alcoholism, depression, even suggested suicide. And what age rating did it receive? A PSR. It's basically a PG, age 9 and up. And the fact that they got away with this can be traced back to Stan's defiance way back in the 70s. The Wall is a special case though. He's not just a comic character, he's part of the Electric Company. Electric Company is a kids show. Its age range is placed about 7 to 10. So it's also a PG, but TV rules are different from comic rules. In kids programming, you're lucky to even show alcohol, never mind having a character suffer from it. Show a beer on Electric and the FCC will send the funny bunny to steal your fucking lungs, which is ironic because the beer commercials that play between kids shows have been linked to a rise in underage drinking. And while it doesn't specifically say in the rules that you can't show a man being mercilessly beaten to death by a street gang, I'm sure it would come under inappropriate actions or something. So, if we were to bring The Wall back with his original presentation, where he appeared in the comic and the TV show, there'd be a lot more restrictions. So how would you tell a similar story without defying these rules? It's easy. Kids shows do it all the time. By being restricted, the creators of these shows have to get more inventive with how they convey their messages, often having to hide the heavy stuff behind wacky childish concepts so that their parents don't freak out. I've lost count the amount of times Amazing World of Gumball has taken on existentialism, or depression, or toxic relationships both on and offline, and it does it at the same time as this shit. Regular Show has characters who are extremely flawed. They're violent, insulting, lazy, they have severe anger problems, and these human traits are used to explore acceptance, intimacy, self-sacrifice. Yes, these are cartoons, and Electric Company is live action. They were made decades apart and have different production companies and budgets, but they all have the same goal: to entertain children from around the age of 7. They all have ludicrous concepts which still manage to convey dark and depressing themes without sacrificing their signature childish tone. I think the show that best embodies this is Adventure Time, a show so incredibly close to my heart. On the surface, it seems like this dumb random XD bullshit with these zany, colourful characters designed for little babies to enjoy. But despite its surface level presentation, Adventure Time at its core is a depressingly dark, beautiful show. Its characters are extremely well written, its lore is insanely creative and intricate, its sense of humour is so unique and rarely falls into the trap of typical kids show jokes. Even the background art is so beautifully crafted it makes me depressed that I can't just jump into the screen and live there. The show is filled with existential dread, with themes of loneliness and trauma and adolescence taking the centre stage. It takes apart your soul and then holds your hand afterwards, letting you know you're not alone and everything's going to be fine. One of my favourite episodes is Season 6's Astral Plane, where Finn is taken out of his body Doctor Strange style and floats about pondering the meaning of life. The episode then ends with the god of Mars suicide bombing into a meteor, which is possibly one of the most powerful moments of television I've ever witnessed. But that's not to say that every single frame is deep and metaphorical. Sometimes the best parts are just some fucking bullshit fart joke. But I want to focus on one character in particular, Simon Petrikov, more commonly known as the Ice King. Much like The Wall, Ice King started off as a complete joke, an over-the-top villain that just acted as a simple obstacle for Finn and Jake. Oh no, we gotta go save the princess from Ice King again, he was basically just Bowser. As the series went on, we got to spend more time with Ice King, and we learned why he was the way that he was. His evil deeds were fueled by severe loneliness and codependency. He always challenged Finn and Jake, but it was just an excuse to hang out with them. And despite actively letting them know this, Finn and Jake didn't care and beat him up anyways. Because he's the Ice King. He's a crazy old ridiculous villain. Seem familiar? And just like Mindworm, the writers and storyboard artists could have just left it there. There's already plenty to unpack and appreciate. But they went further with it. The thing about Adventure Time is that its episodes are really varied. One episode will be this incredible emotional masterpiece, and then the next will be Finn having a kissing competition. So you don't really know what you're gonna get. Which is why it's such a pleasant surprise when, right after an episode about a penguin invasion, you get an episode like I Remember You. The episode begins like any other, with Ice King up to his usual dumb shit. Ice King is jealous of Marceline the Vampire Queen, because she's so good at writing songs and he sucks ass at it. And so he grabs all the material he's been working on and flies over to her house to get help. Like I mentioned before, Ice King is only doing this because he just wants someone to hang out with. Marceline is reluctant to help at first, but gives him a chance and asks to hear what he's been working on. And to no one's surprise, he breaks into this really weird, pervy musical number which devolves into him crying about how alone he is. But instead of dismissing him like everyone else, Marceline shows kindness to him and calls him by the name of Simon. But who's that? This was one of the first times we'd ever heard this name, and even Ice King had no idea what she was talking about. Trying to get him to remember, Marceline goes through all of the old material that he brought with him. These are scribbles on old pieces of paper, newspaper clippings, soup labels. And on one of these old papers, she finds a picture of a young man. His name is Simon, a wise and kind-hearted professor of archaeology. Marceline explains that this is who the Ice King used to be, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and that he and Marceline used to know and care for each other. Ice King has no memory of this and is completely unfazed by this revelation, but he's just happy to know that at one point in his life he wasn't so lonely. Marceline also finds a picture of herself as a child, with Simon's writing scribbled on the back of it. It's a song that Simon wrote dedicated to Marceline, showing his fatherly love for her and fear that he'll lose her. Again, Ice King hasn't a fucking clue what she's talking about, but he thinks it makes for a good song, and so he gets her to sing it with him. There's a very brief moment when they're singing where Ice King might be remembering who he was, but he quickly slips back out of it. I both love and hate moments like these, like in the Clone Wars when Anakin is shown the future and learns that he'll become Darth Vader. He's so determined to prevent it from happening, but then his mind is wiped and you're just like, come on, you were so close! We would soon learn more about Ice King's past in Simon and Marcy, the second highest rated episode next to the show's finale. The world of Adventure Time was always magical make-believe, really fun and imaginative settings like the Candy Kingdom or Lumpy Space, all sorts of colourful places that could never exist in real life. Finn was the only human, the rest of them were weird fantasy creatures. Despite this, there were always subtle hints at a darker history. Relics from our own world were hidden in the background, modern day wreckage, undetonated nukes, even human skeletons, all alluding to a devastating war that took place centuries before the events of the series. Simon and Marcy finally shows us the fallout of this war, following Simon 1,000 years in the past as he tries to protect a young Marceline in a post-apocalyptic wasteland which would later become the colourful setting of the show. At this point in the timeline, Simon has already obtained his familiar Ice Crown, which gives him the power that he needs to fight off the wasteland's deadly creatures. However, this power comes at a cost, and every time he puts the crown on, his appearance is gradually altered, and his mental state gets worse and worse. Even though it's slowly killing him as a person, he knows it's the only chance he has to protect Marceline. And no matter how terrified he is, he does his best to remain calm and tell silly jokes to cheer her up. Marceline makes Simon promise that he won't use the crown again, because if he uses it even one more time, he could lose himself forever. When Marceline gets sick, Simon decides that some chicken soup would make her feel better. In fact, he's so determined to specifically get her chicken soup and won't settle for anything less. And so they go off on a quest for soup, breaking into old stores and trying not to get killed while doing it. I love that while they're breaking into stuff to literally survive, Simon still makes sure that Marceline knows vandalism is wrong. After a close encounter with a zombie, Simon and Marcy find an ambulance, which they assume must have some food in it, right? Except it's not an ambulance, it's a clambulance, and is only filled with fucking clams. Simon is so frustrated, partly due to the mental strain of the crown, and also because he just got baited by some fucking clams, and so he starts kicking the shit out of the clambulance. It is then when they realise that the clambulance is filled with mutated zombies, and Simon is forced to push it off the bridge. Just when you think he saved the day, the clambulance siren goes off and attracts a nightmare horde of zombies. This fucking clambulance! Simon and Marcy run for their lives and are eventually cornered in an alleyway. With no other option, Simon breaks his promise to Marcy and puts on the crown, granting him a far more devastating power than usual to wipe out the entire horde. But the crown's effects are too much for him to bear, and the changes to his appearance and mind become irreversible. Despite putting on the crown to save her, Simon loses his memory of Marceline and who he is as a person. Although he still retains that little bit of instinctual love and finally gets her the chicken soup. What these 2 episodes do is completely recontextualise the Ice King's whole character. His lonely, pitiful existence as a silly old creep is now the result of his loving sacrifice for Marceline, and he rots away in misery, not even aware of the heroic decision that got him there. Previously, he'd tell these stupid, immature jokes, and they were just that. But now there's an extra layer. It was these same jokes that he told to Marceline to comfort her. And as he slowly lost his mind, he couldn't tell the difference between the jokes and his actual personality. That's my interpretation anyways. It's kinda obvious that the crazy ice crown with cool snow powers is a painful allegory for aging and dementia, and how, despite losing the ones closest to you, you should still be there for them and remember who they once were. Adventure Time was rich with this sort of stuff. Usually in cartoons, the characters will take a lot of damage, and in the next shot they'll be totally fine. Finn does this quite a lot. In fact, he'll just jump like 12 fucking stories and kill himself, only to get back up and be totally fine afterwards. This ridiculousness creates a sense of reassurance with the audience. Don't worry guys, Finn can't get hurt for real because he goes through so much shit, both physically and psychologically, and yet he still has that naive charm to take everything on the chin and put others before himself. This was really put to the test in the Citadel episode, when Finn is so desperate to not give up that he loses his arm in the process. Probably my favourite shot of the whole show is when Finn is just lying there in one of his most darkest moments, with Jake comforting him and telling him that everything's going to be okay. And despite what he's just gone through, Finn still smiles and gets on with it. He didn't just get his arm back in the next episode. He had to deal with the permanent loss of his limb, just like anyone else would in the real world. Even when granted with a new arm, it was only temporary, serving as a lesson that there's just some things you've got to live with. Kids need this stuff, because it shows that even their favourite heroes can suffer the same way that they can. I remember an interview with Mark Hamill, where he was visiting a child that had to have his arm amputated, and the kid told Mark that he wasn't scared because Luke Skywalker lost his arm and it didn't stop him from being a hero. It's important that kids have these tragic characters, even if it's in something as harmless as the Electric Company. Spider-Man is like Finn, in the sense that he deals with trauma and grief, yet still perseveres because he's Spider-Man. Unfortunately, the Electric Company's version of Spider-Man is just a thoughtless, two-dimensional madman who forgets he doesn't have a mouth and assaults random people. The lessons at the end are educational to an extent, but they're not exactly going to comfort anyone. Any real message that they go into isn't nearly explored enough to have a genuine impact on the audience. No kid is going to be lying in the hospital like, well, if the wall got crushed to death, then so can I. Adventure Time invalidates the phrase, it's just a kid's show. Imagine if they'd showed some fucking balls and elaborated on the wall's backstory. Perhaps his transformation was the result of self-sacrifice. Maybe the bricks came tumbling down and he pushed his co-worker out of the way. Perhaps the bricks weren't properly laid because he was lazy, and his transformation could serve as a lesson against incompetency. You could also use that to explore the many real-life incidents where people have died due to incompetent construction. And having gone through that traumatic incident, how does the wall cope with it? Clearly he doesn't sit down and give up, because otherwise he wouldn't go to massacre the baseball stadium. 2 panels is all that it would take to show his resilience, or a friend being there for him. What if the wall wasn't real? Instead a figment of Joshua's imagination as he lies in a coma, the ridiculous nature of his dream being attributed to his imminent brain death. What if, like Mindworm, Spider-Man was partially responsible for the wall's creation? Perhaps he was fighting Big Wheel and knocked into the wall that Joshua was working on. What happened after they were sitting on that bench? Did Spider-Man do the same as with Mindworm and appeal to Joshua's good nature and sense of responsibility? Did they team up and fight crime together? Did they become best friends? Lovers? Did they get married? Was their marriage inevitably retconned by Marvel Comics chief creative officer Joe Quesada in a universally hated storyline called One More Wall? Maybe we go meta with it. Perhaps the wall is portrayed as a real person who is playing a character on the Electric Company show. He really is a living wall, and was picked up by the Electric Company who want to exploit tragedy for viewership. There's an infinite number of parallels to that in real life. Perhaps he only got the job because his dad was a writer there. Perhaps they tried to trick him into something controversial for a short-term boost in popularity. Perhaps they tried to force him into an on-screen relationship with a gorilla, despite their lack of chemistry together. Perhaps I've been driven mad by trying to stretch 4 pages into 40-something minutes. But if you're still here, then the cost of my sanity is a worthy price to pay. And even if I am now permanently insane, that's fine. because I still have the wall to find comfort in, because he clearly lost it a long time ago.
What is the wall's weakness? It's Morgan Freeman. It's Morgan oh fuck! It's a fucking cat, but just do it anyway, just do it. There's a fucking wall!
Porque el mundo es tan cruel. I'm filming this on a 3DS. In both the comic and the sketch, the wall shows no sign of distress, anger, or regret regarding the fact that he's a fucking wall. He fully embraces it and doesn't let anyone bring him down. Nothing can stop the wall. I remember my first couple years of high school, when I was around the wall's age, and I was a total dick. Not because I wanted to be, but I felt like I had to be because I didn't want to appear vulnerable. Me and my two only friends would play Minecraft together. We'd play on anarchy servers where there'd be no rules, so it's perfect if you want to be a dick. There was this one server that we were just so notorious on, like, everyone hated us. There were people on that server that wanted me dead in real life, and they would do anything to find us. But we were careful. We had this top secret base buried miles under the ocean floor, and there was no way in or out. The only way to get in would be to get someone else who was already in the base to teleport you in. So given how big the map was, it was statistically impossible for you to find us. We were untouchable. We were walls. And we remained that way until one fateful day when a new player joined the server. He was saying the usual things. Oh, how do I escape spawn? How do I get diamonds? That sort of thing. But we weren't stupid. We knew that people used burner accounts to pretend to be new players to gain access to bases. But this guy was good. He dedicated months and months pretending to know nothing about Minecraft, pretending to be our friend, building up a genuine relationship. This guy was deeper undercover than most CIA agents, and so eventually we invited him to the base. The base we'd spent weeks digging out and building and creating all these automated systems and farms and everything. And the second he teleported in, he did nothing. It was fine. Oh, cool base, man. It was all good, so we logged off and went to bed. It was when I woke up the next day, where I got a dreaded message from my friend, saying, "Mate, the base is gone. It's a fucking crater." I'm panicking. Alarm bells are going off. I'm like, fuck. I'm rushing to my computer. I spawn in right to where I was before, and he's right. The whole thing's fucking gone. And there's a small sign in the center of the devastation. It's a message from the guy. He was letting us know that it was too late. He'd finally won. Shit was like Hydra destroying S.H.I.E.L.D. I had actual terrible things happen to me in my life, and I don't think any of them impacted me as much as that fucking moment. But ultimately, it humbled me. Looking back on my life, I would pinpoint that moment as the start of my emotional maturity. I realised that putting down others didn't make me funny, it just made me insufferable to be around. But despite me becoming more of a genuine and thoughtful person, I was still a dickhead on the outside. I still felt like I had to be the wall, because that was the character I'd set myself up as. People were always going to see me as that, so I was almost embarrassed to change myself. Spider-Man's right, we all need to change. But change is fucking terrifying, especially if it's a conscious decision. That's my wisdom of the hour. Do with it what you want, I'm not your fucking mother.
En toda mi vida,
Siempre quiero comer culo. Yo como mucho culo. Amo al culo.
Me gusta tu culo.
Shut up. I'm fucked. Unless... Shit.
What is it?
You'll never be able to. Everyone be quiet because I need sound for this.
Okay.
Okay, and go.
You'll never be a
Okay, are you... I just actually feel it. Right, are you ready? Mm-hmm. Okay. I'll be like...
That's fine.